Welcome to Side by Side, where I, Robert Kwong, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. This episode is jam-packed with intuitive insights, and it's no wonder because my guest today is Liz Zamorski, a tarot reader, teacher, and your new favorite Chief Happiness Officer. You can find Liz at lizzamorski.com, or please say hello to her on Instagram at thefemgenius. Fair warning, there's a lot to unpack in this conversation, so let's jump right into it. Thank you so much for joining me today and for saying yes. Thank you for playing.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited about what we're going to create side by side here.
I know. I'm so excited. This is probably something that I know lots of people start with, but I know people are just fascinated by your turn from the legal world to what you do now. And people are going to think like, God, like what happened between then and now, and it's so different. There's so much contrast. It made me want to ask you, because I know you've been asked this before, what part of Liz from the corporate legal world where you functioned, where you sometimes thrived, I'm sure, what does that Liz have in common with the Liz that you are now?
That's a great question, and I haven't been asked that. So thank you for framing it in that way. And I think it really boils down to, because I was a good lawyer. I can toot my own horn there. I was really driven. I was a good lawyer. But I feel like what made me a really good lawyer was that I took really broad concepts. And, the famous saying is that, you have a good lawyer when their answer to your question is, well, it depends, ... because things are so rarely black and white. And so I was really good at taking very large concepts and boiling them down, or really stripping them down and explaining them to a client who is not versed in legalese and has not studied all the laws and the ways to use them. And I really boiled them down into usually like 3 or 4 main points to really walk them through, okay, what I'm hearing from your problem are these legal issues. So we're going to take each of those issues, and here's the rule, here's how I would analyze it. And so here's what we're going to do. Here's what I propose. And so I felt like really taking, when people are coming to you and with a really broad issue, really pulling out the topics that are worth discussing, and then breaking them down. That I still do a lot in my work, because people will come to me, they'll book a reading and they'll say, I'm just kind of open. I'm curious about career, or I'm curious about love, or I'm curious about my life purpose. And then I'll say, well, let's talk a little bit more about that. And so we'll have a brief consultation where I just let the person tell me what they think, tell me what they're doing, what's going on with them. And then I start pulling out those little threads that lead to questions. So that's the second thing that I feel like I do really well that is a crossover, is that I really listen actively so that way I can ask deeper follow-up questions. Because a lot of times when someone's coming to a subject matter expert, they don't know what they don't know. They're just saying, I know that I have an issue. Let's say like someone's coming and saying, my neighbor's tree is hanging over my fence. Is there anything I can do? And so you start asking, how long has the tree been there? Was the tree planted before you put up the fence? You start asking these kind of questions that someone may not have thought of before, because they lead to different answers. And so I've really gotten good by being a lawyer at asking follow-up questions that get to the heart of a matter and lead me to giving better answers. And so it's breaking down big concepts and also asking really good questions. And I feel like those are helpful in any area of work, is really being able to put yourself in this position of a subject matter expert and coach your clients through to the heart of a matter. So that way you're really giving them actionable steps, you're giving them advice that helps, or you're helping them to see that they already have the answer inside of them. So those are 2 areas that I feel like have really crossed over well for me.
It's so funny you say that, because now that you've framed it that way, it is like in both the legal world and the intuitive world, let's say the tarot world, it almost, for people who are new to it, feels like, I don't even know, it's like learning a whole new language. like we don't even know how to wrap our minds around these concepts. Or if you just throw someone out to be like, you should do some shadow work, and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it takes someone to be able to translate, to bridge the gap, right?
Yeah. And to say, start asking yourself questions when emotions come. So shadow work, for instance, I would break that down in the following way. I would say, okay, think of something that makes you cringe, or think of something that brings up a difficult emotion like anger or sadness. These emotions that we generally, when we feel them, we want to click off of them really fast. We want to minimize that tab really fast and go back to feeling good, being at homeostasis. And so actually learning how to be with those emotions, learning how to regulate your reaction when those emotions are coming up, is shadow work. And so I'll explain it to someone in that way, and then also put the label on it at the end and say, so when you hear people talking about shadow work, this is the type of thing they're saying. So much of what I do is informing people. It's also activating people so they can use these tools in their own life, like even outside of a reading. But you're absolutely right. People come to me and they're kind of like, I mean, I'll just do the regular, I guess, which is fine. But then I'm like, your time is valuable. My time is valuable. We're here, we're doing this. Let's really get you the answers that you want and that can be used by you. Because if I'm going off on a tangent about, let's say, a relationship, when really they want to find out about career, that's not going to be giving them the answers that they want. So it's so helpful to inform, to educate, and to walk people through the process of any kind of spiritual or any kind of creative work. I'm sure it's like when somebody goes to a painter and they're like, just do something nice for me. It's that's a really broad, it's like, let's narrow that down. Let's narrow down the definition of what you want, so that way we can give you the best thing for you. And that's really what I'm doing as well.
Yeah. How did you get into tarot? Some people are enjoying your presence for the first time.
Yeah.
Um, how did you get into it? And maybe a follow-up would be like, what's your relationship to tarot now, if you could describe it?
Yeah. It's messy. No, I'm just kidding. It's a great relationship, but I got into it back in, this is only a few years ago, but it was back in 2018. And this was in 2018. We really had the rise of the true crime podcasts. Like, that genre was really being built out. So I was listening to a lot of these true crime podcasts when I was going on woods walks, like My Favorite Murder and those, true crime
Serial? Are you into
garage
serial?
serial I was into.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, I'm sitting there, shouting into my headphones, like, no, you're getting the legal precedent wrong. But so I was like most people, and I was listening to this, and I had always been interested in the paranormal. I really like those ghost hunter shows, even the really obnoxious ones. I've always been kind of interested in hauntings and, the esoteric, but in a closeted way. And when I was listening to these true crime podcasts, I thought, I bet there's some really good spiritual or like ghost hunting podcasts too, or, psychic podcasts. I'm interested in that. So I looked them up and I found one that I really resonated with, because his tagline was like 87% less hearts and flowers than other new age blather. And I was like, oh, I like that. Let's call that out, because I want tangible, meaty stuff. And so I started listening to this podcast, and he had so many guests on who were so normal, for lack of better terms, like just people who seemed like, oh, this isn't really out of reach. This is really accessible. It's people who had, you know, day jobs or regular careers, but they were doing their esoteric thing on the side. Some people were reading cards. Some people were doing energy clearing. Some people were doing healings. And it was so fascinating to me. And it really turned me on. And so I took this oracle card reading class through a woman who was one of the guests on this podcast. And I just really opened up. I don't know how else to say it, but something really clicked for me. And I really got into it. I kept going to my day job, being an in-house lawyer at a software company, which is the most non-tarot thing you can think of. And I started developing more of an interest in the oracle cards at first because they felt like I could really tap into my intuition. And then I started listening to tarot readings on YouTube, like on my commute to and from work when I was on this long bus ride. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's like learning a new language day by day, just like piece by piece. I started finding that someone would say, like, and then we've got the Eight of Wands. And I could feel myself over time starting to react and being like, ooh, it's coming in fast, huh? Like, just because I had started absorbing the meanings of the cards as people were talking about them. So then I decided to take a tarot card course, and it was really difficult because the aim of that course was really to memorize 78 meanings of cards, and like you have to know what each meaning is, as opposed to actually using the tarot as a tool to use with your own subconscious. So I took this course. I said, no, thank you, ma'am. And I walked away from it at the end. And I basically started pulling in my own school of thought around how to use the tarot and how to really make it my own and how to teach others how to do the same. And so, cut to now, 4 years later, where I'm now reading the tarot full time, and it's the thing that lights me up the most. Like, I can feel and see and hear a significant shift in my energy and in the way I talk and in the way I go into the messages that are coming through, just having the cards in my hand. It's like something else takes over. And I call it my subconscious, but my subconscious takes over. And I liken it to interpreting your dreams, right? Is that the subconscious speaks to us in symbols, in archetypes. And it's just like when you wake up from a dream and you're like, it was so weird. Like, I saw myself walking down this hall and I knew it was my house, but it didn't look like my house. And, like you kind of go through, and then this dog showed up, and then this and this. And if you went to a dream journal or a dream dictionary, you would look up all the symbology and say, like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Only in the tarot, we're looking at that symbology and then we're asking ourselves, what does that mean? What does that mean to me? What else comes up when I'm looking at these symbols? What's it activating in me? What stories coming through? So I always say that it's a verbal tool where we're really pulling cards and it's verbalizing the energy or the symbols that are already coming through from your subconscious. And because we're using cards, we're using this tool that's a game. It disarms the ego. Like, it disarms our gatekeeper of the subconscious. So our ego is so caught up in trying to find the right answer for, like, what does this card mean, that our subconscious gets to kind of slip in and say, like, here's what it means, if you're ready to hear it. This was a really long-winded answer. I hope I'm answering your question about how I got into the tarot.
I'm so fascinated right now. Please do not apologize.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the way that I work with it now is that I do one-to-one readings for people. I do some group readings. I also teach people how to read the tarot in this intuitive way, where I pull in the history of how the tarot was developed. I pull in the meanings of the cards. I also pull in the way that I logically split apart the deck into, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, like into 6 parts. I didn't have it off the top of my head how many parts, but it's, instead of just splitting things up by suit and saying, okay, like, here's this, and here's the pentacles, and here's the cups, I break it up into 6 very logical chunks that go together. And so it's creating neural pathways in your brain. I'm also pulling in philosophy, Jungian philosophy, and different schools of thought. So we're really building this whole context. I pull in numerology, I pull in symbology, astrology sometimes as well. So it's really building out this really rich understanding and a context that lays the scene for any cards that you pull. And I get really excited because I love numbers. And when you pull, like, when we see the Celtic cross spread, it's 10 cards on the table and they each have their own position. And there are 78 cards in the deck. And so there are over 4 trillion combinations of the Celtic cross. And I love saying that because it always blows me away, where in each position and with each of the 78 cards, you have over 4 trillion combinations. And a tarot reader who's reading, especially intuitively, I tell people, like, once we're done learning the basics, you can pull any of those 4 trillion combinations and get an answer to a question. It's really about building your self trust. It's about building context around a new concept, and it's around building a practice. You wouldn't expect a surgeon to come out of med school. I'm not calling tarot readers surgeons, but you wouldn't expect a surgeon to come out of med school and be able to perform a surgery in the same way as when they've been practicing for 20 or 25 years. You start learning the nuances, you start learning more, you start developing more context for your gift and your practice. So it's just like that. You're creating a practice, you're creating muscle memory, and you're creating an evolving relationship between you, your subconscious, and this tool. So I really love practicing with the tarot. I love igniting others and activating others to practice with it. And I use it for everything. I use it for business planning. I use it for vacation planning. I use it for in relationships. I use it in all kinds of things. It's really asking my subconscious, like, what is it that I really want? Or what is it that I really would love to see happen here? And then once I'm able to verbalize that, then I can make a plan. So it's really getting to the heart, again, getting to the heart or the core of my questions or the core of a matter, and being able to plan, execute, or create from there.
Did you just channel that? Thank you for that sermon, girl.
You're so
Like,
welcome.
I'm just like, and that's the wrap. Thank you,
Yeah.
folks. No.
Thank you, everybody.
No, thank you for. Okay, so what I'm trying to capture is like the level of excitement and engagement you have with these gifts, and also your belief in that other people can engage with it however they want, as much as they want, and that it's not so much one that's built inside of some people are just special and some people are not, you know what I mean? And
Right.
that's what I love about evening the playing field when it comes to understanding our intuition, our creativity, and also some of our subconscious patterns. I find doing something that is highly interpretive to be actually very healthy, especially if you have some guardrails. So, everyone, please check out Liz's tarot handbook. It's really insightful. Um, so, how has working with intuition and even a little mediumship, let's be real, change your relationship to your ancestry and your lineage? The reason I ask is because for me, I had to unlock and unblock a lot of my relationship to family and the family tree, and how much of it was stuck and glued to family tree relative to mom and dad. And actually, in opening up my intuition, I had to like take in other stories, other perspectives, other generations, and it really did something for me. So I'm curious how that has shifted your relationship to your lineage.
That's a really big question. Another one I've never been asked. So I love this question. So bear with me if I bumble through this. It's fascinating that you asked that, because on my table where I sit and do tarot, the table that I'm sitting at right now, I have photos of my ancestors as far back as they go. So I'm looking right now at my paternal grandmother and grandfather when they were really young. I have my paternal grandmother's old mother of pearl cigarette case. That's what I keep my matches in to light my candles. Like, I really have developed this practice of honoring them in different ways. I always have like a little cup of water, a little cup of coffee or tea sitting on my table for them as well. Just really honoring what they went through for me to even be here. And I'll say that I did a DNA test, took a DNA test. Turns out I'm 100% that bitch. No. But I took one of those DNA tests about a year and a half ago, and it blew my mind, because on my mom's side, there's a lot of adoption and a lot of questions around who's who and where she came from and all of that. So that had really felt like a missing piece for me. And then on my father's side, we know a lot of generations back, on both his mother's side and his father's side. And so what I found out when this DNA test came back was that I'm a quarter Swedish, and I'm living in Sweden right now. Like through this really strange turn of events in my life, I ended up marrying a Swede, in Dubai. I met a guy in Dubai. He was Swedish, I was American. We got married. We moved to Sweden. We're living on this land. And then I take this ancestry test and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm literally like on my ancestral land with basically like a quarter of me that I had never known was from here. So I feel like I've done a lot of healing with unknown ancestors, just working with the land here, which has been really powerful for me. Like I said, a lot of my awakening was happening walking in the woods. So once I found out this information about my bloodline, I really started putting more intention on that. Really putting more intention on this being ancestral land of some sort, not knowing who they are, but offering up some love and some support and receiving that in return. From my father's side, where we know a lot of that lineage, I started getting in a lot deeper contact with, just intuitively, with who, especially the women, would have been in that lineage, and where they would have lived and what type of life they would have been living, and really allowing myself to forgive a lot of the unwell patterns that have been passed down, like where work has to be hard and you have to really endure even the worst, conditions and never say anything and never speak up for yourself. And then also pulling in what I like to call my well ancestors, or the well ancestry, the healthy ancestry, where it was a long line of survivors who prayed for the life that I have now, who pray, generation after generation, literally prayed and begged for their children to have a better life. And to see that, only a few generations down the line, even in my deepest struggles, my life is very easy from day to day compared to what they went through. So there's been a lot of reconciliation within myself about the way I was raised. And then also, again, like really feeling this pull to reconnect with the land, knowing that those women were definitely living off the land and creating medicine and food and warmth and sustenance off of the land. And I felt like this real call to continue that cycle, or to bring back that cycle. And that has opened up my intuition and my channel so deeply. It's also, this is just a funny side story. Like, it's also really helped me release a lot of trauma in my body, where I find that I have to like go to an osteopath. I just came back from the osteopath because, and I'm not saying that there's definitely a link, but I will say, like, the more I open up and the more I see like how my body responds, and like when I need to be adjusted or when I need to have something massaged out, it's not a coincidence anymore, where I'm like, okay, I'm doing a lot of work. I'm probably going to wake up next week like with a crick in my neck. So I better make that appointment with the osteopath. So it's so interesting, like with the body keeps the score, like the ways that we hold generational trauma in our bodies. And then when we start opening that or releasing that, how everything kind of changes. So I feel like I'm holding my ancestry in my body differently. I'm expressing it differently. And I'm seeing it not so much as a burden, but as a reason to really, or a thing that I can really draw strength from.
Yeah, to me, when I first started tuning in, like you and I know each other a little bit, and I have this relationship with intuition and tapping into my musical gifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and people would comment early on, they'll be like, "Oh, you seem different." They would start inquiring, particularly guys, were like, "How are you working out, man?" And I would have to disappoint them every time. I was like, "I hate to tell you this, but my diet and my exercise is piss poor. I'm very much a work in progress." But I would tell them, even though I don't know everyone would understand it, I said, trauma healing or trauma work, which is what I use my intuition to do. It's not fun. It can be a lot of fun, but trauma healing is not always fun. But I made that choice because it wasn't like it became a natural anti-inflammatory in my body. And so my body was going through a lot of changes that I think from the outside in, people were sort of like trying to figure me out. And it would just kind of make me chuckle because I know that my answer would disappoint them, which is I did something that's a little bit outside the norm, similar to the way you talk about holding in how you hold ancestry in your body. You know, a few years ago, I I would not be describing stuff this way, but what you're talking about resonates with me.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so fascinating too to see how science is catching up with what we're talking about. Where 10 years ago, meditation was really out there and Reiki really out there. And now I have friends in the medical field, nurses who work in ERs or who work in NICUs in the US who are telling me like, oh, I'm getting trained in Reiki to use it at work. Yeah. And where hospitals are offering Reiki, my someone who's close to me recently had to get some work done on their spine. And when they went to the HMO approved practitioner, they were getting acupuncture, which, yes, it has proven anti inflammatory benefits as well, you know, a whole litany of benefits. However, you know, think back like 10 years, was mindfulness and meditation and Reiki and acupuncture, were those used on a wide scale mainstream medical wavelength? No, for the most part, no. And so I really feel like what you're talking about and what I'm talking about and what other people are awakening to, I'm really hoping that it's just a matter of time until medicine catches up and we have evidence-based research that says actually when you do heal trauma or when you heal and we're starting to see some of it, but when you heal trauma or when you heal the trauma that's passed down to you through epigenetics, like through our DNA that's changed or altered through trauma, that when we are healing those strands of DNA, when we're healing that in our bodies, we're healing the DNA that we pass on, or we're healing the presentation of our alleles and our genome. And so I can't wait. Maybe I'm part of it. I don't know. Maybe you're part of it too, but I can't wait until science really starts catching up and they start saying, you know, actually, when you're reading tarot, this is actually what's happening on a neuro-linguistic level. Or, okay, when we're doing Reiki, here's actually maybe it's the power of belief that changes our mindset and that presents differently in our bodies. Whatever it is, same thing with astrology, you know, all of this. I'm just hoping that medicine is going to start catching up or that science will start catching up to legitimize these practices, because I see, and I know you see too, with client after client or person after person, when we have these conversations or when we go through healing practices or when we just read the tarot, something's really changing rapidly through the collective, rapidly through humanity, where, you know, on one hand, you hear a lot of people being like, it's a real dumpster fire out there. And fine, maybe it is. But on the other hand, you see a lot of people who are doing a lot of work to try to stabilize humanity as well, instead of just watching its quote unquote like inevitable demise. That if you're just watching the news, that's what it looks like. However, there are many of us out there who are really doing this work to kind of hold the line and say like, hey, wait a second, we're better than this. Let's tap into those channels and really start coming up with solutions, really start honoring our ancestry, really start honoring our feelings and our emotions to enact change for the better.
There is something about, you know, I'm not a black and white person, but there is something about, oh, is your intention to spend your time trying to make the world a better place or a worse place? You know, a little bit like that sometimes with, again, we had this discussion right before we started recording about owning personal power that is separate from this unhealthy attachment to your ego. But at the same time, I do believe in the value of having a strong sense of self, a strong core, a set of values, and knowing how to correct your mistakes or own up to it. And those things are also related to your ego. If there's no ego, then anything goes, which I think fundamentally has some severe consequences. So it's interesting to try to be a a change maker in this world in this way, like you say. And I do think we're making some progress. Switching gears a little bit, because I find time with you to be so precious. Um, since you've opened up your intuitive channels and your intuitive gifts, um, You have children, correct?
Yeah, I have one child. Yeah.
One child. Okay. How has that impacted opening up your intuition impacted parenting?
Another great question that I'm not usually asked. So thank you for asking that. It's such a rich question, and it's such a rich story as well, where being a trauma survivor and being an abuse survivor, and also working through my own trauma healing while parenting has been a wild ride anyway. Really looking at my child for the first time right when she was born, and the first feeling I had was constriction, where I felt like I looked at her little face and I went, oh no. Like, this is such a precious, unmarred, untouched little person, little soul who's just so pure. And how do I not mess this up for her? Like, how do I not do the same to her that was done to me? And it caused a lot of fear and detachment and constriction, in me. And those first, especially couple years, I kind of feel like it's like Two-Face from Batman, where I had made the decision, like, for my daughter, I will show her love, I will show her compassion, I will show up for her, I will be the light for her, because that's what she deserves. But simultaneously, I need to be working through how I had been affected all throughout my childhood, what had affected me. And so those first couple of years, it was really this back and forth, or this almost masking, in front of her. And she was so little, as an infant and then a small toddler, that I really took it seriously. Like, I just need to imprint on her that she's loved, that she's important, and that she's safe. Beyond that, I don't know what else to do. When I then went through my spiritual awakening, which was when she was around 4, it really felt like I had a lot more confidence in how to connect with her, to trust myself to connect with her, to trust myself to get it wrong as well as getting it right. Um, and it really transformed our relationship, because I felt like I really stepped into showing up as my authentic self, and not trying to raise a person, but to basically co-create with her and teach her how to create the life she wants. Um, which I know sounds really big when you're talking about a 4-year-old, but it's as simple as, for me, sitting with her on the floor and like coloring in a coloring book and talking about what we were doing, and like really building connection and building trust and safety in herself around who she is, what she wants. So tapping into my intuitive gifts has made me a lot more of a playful mother. It's taken a lot of the edge off for me. Things don't feel so absolute, like, oh my gosh, I'm scarring her for life. I can forgive myself and move on much quicker. And I'll tell you that, like, a walk in the woods with my 8-year-old, who's been with an intuitive, I like to use the word witch now, but with an intuitive, witchy mother for the past 4 years, nature has really become our playground, and our imaginations have really become ignited. And that's part of the tapestry that we're weaving together. And Picasso said, like, all children are artists. And really tapping into my intuition and trusting myself with her has allowed me to really open up to what she's offering in the world, and who she is and how she's showing up. So it's been a really beautiful time together. And now that we're moving into the tween years, where she's about to be 9, this like 9, 10, 11 phase before she's a teenager and she's starting to figure out where she fits in the world. It's such a time of hope, where I feel like when I was that age, that was when, your parents kind of start pulling away from you, because you're not a dependent little child anymore. And then you're not the rebellious teenager yet. So you're just kind of in this middle space, where where you're kind of left to your own devices a lot, at least I was. So I feel like we're really approaching that time that can usually feel like a black hole a bit, in a much more engaging way. So it's exciting. I love hanging out with her.
I love that. I love having role models for something like self expression and intuition. Um, Certainly, I know people in my family who are very intuitive people, but it was just suppressed and pushed away and denied and unaccepted throughout their whole life. And as they got older, there were consequences. It turned into other things, these things that we're meant to embody, we're meant to live by. Um, so thank you for being someone who can model that for your daughter.
Thank you.
And you and your partner is interesting because your partner is very open, at least it seems to me, about being intuitive and being very open about in certain areas that are stereotypically considered more feminine. And there's also discussions about, who has intuition, who has not, and also who's feminine and who's masculine in terms of this type of work. Who are the traditional, like, who, what do nurses look like versus lawyers, that's related to these stereotypes. Um, to you, do you feel like for men, let's say, who are interested in these things but feel like there are a lot of cultural barriers and just they have to work through their own thing of the self-consciousness similar to how I have, and you being, with someone who's also very open and comfortable with this, do you have any recommendations for, like, I would say, like, men in particular? Because I think this area feels more natural to people who identify as women and feminine. But you and I are trying to be like, no, we're saying like human beings deserve to understand their intuition, right? So do you have
Yeah.
anything to say to men, which is might be an interesting question.
Yeah. To the men in the place. No.
Yes.
But it's really interesting because, and another fascinating question, because I think about this a lot, why intuition is, so feminine, like a woman's intuition, we hear that a lot, and why men are taught to shut it off so early. Because I am of the school of thought that we're all psychic, that we all have this ability, that we all have intuition, and that we all have the ability to tap into whatever this kind of collective energy is, and that many of us use it already. Like I use the example of, have you ever procrastinated on a paper for so long, like in school, in high school or college or post grad, where you're you're sitting there the night before it's due, and suddenly you sit down and you somehow just like get 10 pages out of your brain and onto a paper, and then you read it and you're like, this is really good. How did this happen? I'm not advocating procrastination. It worked for me. But when I look back on that now, I always say to people, I'm like, have you ever done that before? Guess what? You were channeling information. And I'm not saying like
Right.
channeling as in from, some cloud in the sky, but where you're really tapping into, you're surrendering, you're tapping into the collective consciousness, or you're tapping into the information that needs to get onto the page, and you're letting it come through. Or people who stand up and can speak, who can do public speaking and extemporaneously and just kind of go and make something sound really good, and then they come off stage and they're like, how did I do? You're like, that was amazing. How did People who do improv, people who can do stand-up comedy really well, where they're reading a crowd and then delivering, you know, people who can hold space, musicians, like there's so many.
Speakers. Yeah.
Yeah, all of it. Designers, artists. I mean, even people all over Wall Street who are making, I'm not going to go into Wall Street, but where people are making educated guesses on, like, this is where we see the trend going. And sure, they have some raw data that they're looking at and that they're extrapolating from. However, a lot of that stuff, when you ask people, they're like, I just had a hunch. I just had a hunch. And of course, that hunch may be informed by years of experience or seeing trends, but you're using your gut, you're using your intuition. And it's not saying that it has to be in the absence of experience, or in the absence of data, or in the absence of trends or patterns. It's saying like, use all of that. This is also going back to your first question when you asked me about being a lawyer and being an intuitive or being a psychic, is that I am drawing on those skills. I'm using those. And so first off, I just want to say men, women, non-binary, everybody's psychic in some way. Everybody's tapped in some way. For people who don't identify as feminine, who feel like there's a stigma on them about tapping into their intuition, first of all, I want to say good for you for even asking these questions, but also start small. Like you don't have to go out and open a YouTube channel and start reading tarot and all of that. The way that my partner got into it, because I definitely started on the spiritual journey before he did. And for him, it was really doing intuitive art. So just sitting down and starting to sketch and seeing what came through, or doing intuitive painting, where he was just like, I don't know what I want to paint, but I'm just going to start putting some, brush strokes on the canvas and kind of see what this turns into. And then suddenly, like, boom, there's a dragon. And then we're both reading the dragon together, like, what does this mean? Or why did I do it that way? So I say, like, start with what start with what's comfortable for you. If you're someone who's really into sports, let yourself just kind of like get into your zone when you're performing or whatever. And let yourself go into that mode where you're just led, where you're like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I just feel like I should. I don't know why I'm going to like juke this way with the ball, but I'm just going to trust and see where it takes me. So starting with what you don't have to pull in other tools. Just start noticing where in your body you're feeling led from. Is it from your head? Is it from your heart? Is it from your gut? Is it from your feet? Noticing those little things and then starting to build on them is enormous, because I see a lot of women who allow themselves to explore in this way, where they're like, well, I really love to dance, so I'm just going to be in my house by myself, put on some music and let myself move some energy through dance. I'm not a skilled dancer, I'm not a choreographer, but I just really enjoy it. Find what lights you up and do more of that. And that to me is one of the biggest springboards into opening your intuition and letting it develop, letting it guide you.
Oh, that was so good. Okay. This will have to be another hour of conversation for another
Okay.
time, but there's something about everything you just described that I think could be so powerful in people healing their relationship to divine masculine, which I also believe. Like, if we believe there's a feminine, there must be a balance of a masculine energy that is in service of humanity. Would you like to come back for another conversation another time, Liz?
I would love to. And I would love to talk about whatever you want to talk about, because this was fascinating and fabulous. But I love diving into the topic of divine femininity and divine masculinity, and also the flip side of it, because I feel like we have more touch points sometimes for identifying toxic femininity and toxic masculinity. So like
That's right.
starting there can be really helpful, because so many people can see it so much more clearly. We have so many examples of that. And then being able to see how we can transform that into the divine masculine, or non-toxic masculine, non-toxic feminine. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I would love to.
Oh, this is so good. And thank you so much for your time today. And one last time, tell us where people can reach you, where you typically spend your time online, and anything else you would like listeners to know.
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram. I hang out there a lot at the Fem Genius. And I'll let you know a little secret is that my stories are really where it's at. I do post on the grid a lot, but I love to interact with people and engage with people up in the stories. I feel like it's kind of like inviting people into my living room and having a little chat. So if you want to come hang out in my living room for a little bit, check out my Instagram stories, and also on my website, lizzamorski.com. I have a couple freebies on there too, of like a little tarot cheat sheet if you want to kind of start playing with the tarot and making it make sense in your mind. I definitely recommend that. And then yeah, check out the tarot handbook or a one-on-one reading, and I would love to see you.
Yes, please resource Liz and take advantage of her gifts. And Thank you for your time today, Liz. I can't wait to speak to you again.
Thanks so much. You too.
Thank you for tuning in. And if you'd like to share your creative process, please email Robert at robertkwongcoaching.com. I'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to stay connected, you can find me at robertkwongcoaching.com and on Instagram at robertkwongcoaching.